Hi everyone, I'm Vikas. This will be a little bit more of a product talk, less of a science talk. But hopefully you'll take a few interesting things away. This is work jointly led by Saurav and Viet, my students, with lots of contributions from folks at UW-Madison, Post-Tech, and UNC Chapel Hill. So what do we want to do? We want to set up a foundation model for resting state fMRI. And the reasons are numerous, but some of them are, for example, less need for handcrafted features. This type of a model may give you more immunity to variations across sites and acquisition protocols. And finally, one of the important ones was that suppose we could train this model, could we then apply some small fine tuning on smaller sample size data sets and use it for downstream tasks? So that was the high level motivation. And we would not do away with standard pre-processing pipelines. So we'll take our data, map it to an atlas, do parcellation, and then you would have n different ROIs. And at each ROI, we would have some sort of a average time series signal sitting at that ROI, and that is going to be the input to our model. Okay. So when we talk about foundation models, it's it's mandatory to start with transformers. Terry talked about it in the talk this morning, partly because these models are essentially dominant across almost all applications in natural language processing, as well as in computer vision, where most state-of-the-art applications involving object localization, segmentation, and such are based on transformer backbones. So in the context of resting state fMRI, at iClear last year, there was this nice paper called BrainLM, where they demonstrated using a transformer backbone with resting state fMRI data, you pre-process it. If the data set is large enough, these models are extremely performant for downstream machine learning and statistical analysis tasks. So this was a good kind of a data point to have. And then last year at NeurIPS, this BrainJEPA architecture came along, which offered additional improvements. And the reason I'm kind of showing this figure from the paper here is just to kind of set up the training pipeline. So we have time series data. You would often tokenize it, and then you decide on your masked language modeling task, which would basically involve taking your tokens either in the same channel, how they attend to each other, or across channels, and then predicting the masked tokens, right? So that's what your overall training procedure would correspond to. There are a couple of other small bells and whistles, which we don't need to get into. But over the last 6 to 9 months, there's a growing body of work kind of questioning whether transformer models are the right model for time series data. So there are a number of reasons, but maybe two prominent ones are the following. So time series data, you would need to decide on what your tokenization scheme is going to be. And depending on what your domain is, that could affect how well your pre-trained model translates to the downstream tasks you have in mind. And secondly, if you have to fine tune or if you have to retrain, the compute footprint, as the sequence length grows, the compute footprint could get quite large. So one of the questions we were starting to grapple with was, can we avoid self-attention altogether? And just to kind of position where our work sits, so on the top left, you see most of these transformer models that are in production systems today from Google and OpenAI. On the top right, you see the state space models that Terry attributed to this morning, S4, Mamba 2. And on the bottom, you see this evolving body of work on physics-informed neural networks. And our work kind of sits somewhere in that neighborhood between state space models and pins. Okay, so let me give you the high-level overview of what the construction corresponds to. So here, what we have is think of U and V to be the latent space representation of your response signal and a control signal. And the term on the right, you can think of it as a self-drift, which is dependent on maybe ut minus 1 or my current state. So what the first term in the top expression is doing is it's telling you how the control signal, this could be the signal at other ROIs, how that signal is going to influence the latent representation or latent measurement at time t for the response signal that is u sub t. And for the moment, we can ignore the self-drift term corresponding to ut minus 1. Then what we have is an operator parameterized by theta that gives you the mapping between the S domain and the T domain. So this might look a little bit similar to convolution, but remember that the mapping here is not just dependent on T minus S, but dependent on T and S together. So it's time variant rather than time invariant. Now, if in this case, if U and V start growing in sequence length, you can imagine that this inverse problem that I've written down at the bottom, the size of the matrix version of this operator A starts growing also, right? And so that's a big problem if you want this to be computationally feasible. And so the reason I brought this up is essentially to tell you that that even if we pose it in this form, based on imposing some structural properties on this operator A, the problem can be solved very efficiently. So the main trick is to think about taking your V to the wavelet domain, taking your U also to the wavelet domain, and then, and then the operator A can be decomposed into a form where you're only estimating the components that will eventually build up the full operator A. You're never fully materializing the big matrix A, and this overall procedure can be done using an algorithm that has existed for 20 years. So this is a solver that we can utilize directly. All right. So now let me set up the way we will model this problem. So what we have here, everything is happening in the latent space. We assume access to an encoder and a decoder. But the latent representation, you think of the control signal as well as the variable z, which corresponds to the measurement at this specific ROI. The control signal corresponds to some measurement at other ROIs. Those two, through some function f, parameterized by theta, is getting mapped to zp plus 1. And now, if you have a decoder, let's say that's parameterized by h, that is taking the latent representations and bringing it back to your observations. So your loss calculation will be in the x sub t space. And if you collect all of this, then you can write down a dynamical system, dz over dt, given by z and u moving forward with respect to a parameterized vector field. And then you also have some initial conditions. If you write down the integral form, then the measurement at z sub t is going to be given by the integral 0 through t of this entire effect of the vector field acting upon the latent representation z, as well as the latent representations of the control signal, right? All right, so a few additional terms. If you decompose this, the operator that I wrote down in the previous slide, then we have an autonomous drift term that does not depend on other ROIs. That is my own self drift term. And there is a control-dependent modulation of my dynamics based on what's happening to the other RO, right? That's the way we think of decomposing the operator. And now if you take the K curve, integrate it from 0 to t, then that gives you the parameterized nonlinear operator that I described earlier. That is where we are going to call the wavelet decomposition. And then you write down the integral form. So this is basically where all of these things come together. You have the operator K written in terms of the separable wavelet basis that we saw earlier that we have a ready-made solver for. And that, in principle, should give you a way to model the dynamics at myself influenced by the dynamics at the other ROIs. The problem is that this construction works very nicely for a few dimensions. So you can make this implementation run very well for neural mass models. But when you want to scale it up to higher dimensions, as is the case for us, it's not really very effective. So there you bring in some standard computational tricks. In this case, we use the block tensor decomposition to scale it up to higher dimensions, and the whole thing works quite nicely. So just to put everything together, on the left, you have the pre-processing steps. The data is getting kind of mapped into this atlas space, and which is ready now for the module in the center where we are learning the dynamics. And then finally, after you run some fine-tuning, you can regress or perform classification or whatever downstream tasks you have in mind. So with our experiments and evaluations, we went a bit overboard. So we covered HCP, ADNI. We have some local DARPA projects going on, the epilepsy connectome, and a bunch of other data sets we could get our hands on. And we ran experiments with all possible, combinations and fine-tuning configurations. So just to give you a little bit of a overview, when we pre-train on the HCP data set with about 1,000 samples using an 80-20 split, you get a training error of about e to the minus 5. And on the test held out set, you get about 0.0001 reconstruction accuracy, which suggests that the model is doing sensible things. Here is just a reconstruction at a specific level of frequency. So you can see the shapes are getting mashed. You can keep adding more frequencies and progressively the reconstruction gets better. Coming back to our compute efficiency. So this is a 2 billion parameter model. On HCP, you can train this on 2 GPUs in about 4 hours. So computationally, it's quite attractive compared to other alternatives that exist. So we don't yet have scientifically exciting results. So we did what you would usually do with respect to benchmarks and see how it compares to other methods. So if the downstream tasks are ADNI and the UK Biobank, and you run this for classification and regression tasks across a whole bunch of these downstream tasks, we see that the accuracy or goodness of fit or whatever your criteria of goodness might be, we get improvements, but also with compute efficiency gains. Similarly, we ran experiments on HCP aging. Again, a very similar trend with respect to the types of regression and classification tasks people do in the literature. We are able to get good performance across the board. So for the epilepsy connectome project, what we did was we just downloaded the pre-trained model weights, performed a little bit of fine-tuning without any hyperparameter adjustment, and then ran experiments for both classification as well as regression. And again, for some of the harder tasks, we see that the accuracy is reasonable, not super great. For other tasks, the accuracy is strong. For a local data set at the Center for Healthy Minds, where we are interested in understanding the role of meditation on emotional well-being and cognition, There are a number of response variables that are not expected to be associated strongly with resting state fMRI measurements, and others are. We follow the same procedure here. We took the pre-trained model, fine-tuned it on these response variables. In some cases, the errors are high, up to 20% error. In some other cases, the errors are in the 5 to 10% range, indicating that the model is able to latch onto these concepts. So this is my final slide. I hope I have conveyed to you that this is a lightweight, attention-free model for resting state fMRI. You can fine-tune it on smaller data sets. We have had initial success, but I'm happy to chat with you more if you have some data sets that you would want to give this a test try. There is no quadratic scaling problem, which is common in attention. So this is, as in Terry's talk, this is super linear, but not quadratic. So, and the code will be available soon, but, ping me if you want to give this a try. That's all I have. Thank you.